The fact of corporate governance remains one of the very key indicators, or better yet, one of the very key templates that can be deployed towards addressing issues around human rights and business. I want to say that because of the experience I've gathered over the years, working with companies at different levels, working with companies that have like a boardroom system, like a very qualitative boardroom structure, being in those rooms where diverse issues come up around the operations of these companies in different sectors, the mining sector, for example, the real estate sector, the investment sector. Having to sit down in some of these rooms and listening to the discussions that go on in these rooms gives you the feeling of the possibilities that exist if companies knew much more about human rights and business, especially in Nigeria, for example. When you talk about human rights and business, maybe to a small business owner, they may necessarily not get what you're trying to say. The first thing, they'll be like, okay, whose rights am I violating? I'm not violating anybody's rights. So where does human rights come into this entire picture? At the same time, you would now realize that the UNGPs necessarily doesn't cater for the informal sector in terms of the businesses within the informal sector, even though the UNGP strives to ensure that people within the business value chain, like the workers on the farms, the workers in the plants, in the industries, those who work in the mining sites, those who work in garment factories, the UNGP seeks to provide some level of advisory and the possibility of protections for people within these spheres. But I've come to realize that companies on the low level necessarily are not thinking around issues of human rights and business. They might be looking at recruitment issues. They might be looking at issues that would affect individuals, employees, the relationship between stakeholders and the employees and all of that. They might even have policies that, reflect certain human rights indicators or indices. Those reflections may be there, but necessarily those actions of these companies are not based on, the core human rights and business thinking, which the UNGP tries to advance and projects. So it's very important that when you as a company, you are a CEO, you're a CFO, whatever you are in the C's, the CCO's executive, at that level, you should avail yourself. Of course, European companies, very big tech companies, big companies across the world, the whole mainstreaming of human rights into the operational efficiencies of those companies, like it's taking roots. A lot of companies are also providing human rights due diligence support services. People are going into the ESG space, trying to just see how we can have like a better environment for MNCs, multinational corporations, and top companies that do the heavy numbers and the heavy lifting. We're talking about these very big companies. So much is going on within that space already. And it's very important, it's very key to see how that Nigeria can begin to look inwards through the public display of a national action plan that will help to guide the psyche of companies that do business in Nigeria to also begin to look at the possibilities of ensuring that we have a system that caters not just to advance the profitability of companies, but to see that companies begin to show a very high level of responsibility. That's very key. That's very important. There's so much to be done. And the time to start is now. And basically what I try to do in this video is just to see how that top executives who attend board meetings, who are within the management level in companies, must begin to find a new means of reorienting themselves with these core principles of human rights and business. And of course, it's not really so much of a big deal if we can have executives begin to understand what human rights and business seeks to achieve I believe that, on the entire value chain, where it hurts the most is at the level of, people who are working for companies, people who are trying to make ends meet, people who are the receiving end of, maladministration of companies that affect the human rights of people within the value chain of business processes. Those are the individuals that are on the receiving end of all of this. So if we can begin to see where executives are playing a vital role in educating themselves to align with global best practices that the UNGP has provided that template for companies to rely upon to do good for businesses, to do good for employees, to do good for stakeholders, to do good for communities, it's just going to make the world just a very, very much better place. We want to live in a world that is better. We want to live in a world that addresses these issues. But before we can address them, people actually need to know that these issues even exist in the first place. Europe is doing a very great job. The UN office in charge of human rights and business doing a very great job. There are a lot of companies doing a very great job across Europe. Countries, of course, in Uganda, in Tunisia, you can see that there's a very high level of awareness in some African countries. We need to begin to drive that same level of awareness in Nigeria. I'm not saying that hasn't existed. For example, if you look at the sectors like the oil and gas sector, for example, and you now cascade that into all that has been happening within the Niger Delta region, you would realize that so much advocacy has been going on around issues on human rights and business with multinational companies. That's a very great step. That's a step to start from. But we must move that same energy to begin to look at mining companies, for example, in northern part of Nigeria. I've read stories in the papers where for women to work in mine sites, they have to pay forward through sexual intercourse with maybe managers on the mine site before they can come in there to try to fend for themselves and make a living. That's totally unacceptable. We cannot live in a society where we just allow some of these things to pass by, because the framework to protect people, even though present to some extent, but the ignorance about this system is really sickening, and we must begin to do something about it. I just felt that this video might fall on the laps, of course, fall on the hands, on the phones of anybody who has that authority of decision to ensure that we can begin to make the little change that we can. One change on the other, society becomes a better place. Of course, how was Europe built? Europe wasn't built in a day. It wasn't built in a day. Africa, we must embrace a new consciousness, and that consciousness can give us the pathway to better responsibility for companies, for corporations, for multinational corporations, for the heavy lifters in the financial space. We owe ourselves that duty to begin to push this narrative of human rights and business. I'll see you on the next video, guys. Do have a wonderful time.